Alright guys, how are we doing today? Hope you're doing well. In this video I'm going to be talking about what I see is a very serious potential for probably England's future in the coming decades, and that is fragmentation. And the picture behind me is kind of really representation of the topic of this video. I think there are a lot of threats, quite frankly, facing England now and probably coming down the line. One thing that I want to kind of say right off the bat here is that I'm not outright anti-immigration, or I'm not entirely outright against multiculturalism or different ethnicities, races being together in the same society. I don't think that's a problem in and of itself, but I will get into what I think some of these issues can be when those things are kind of left to become silos or enclaves, or whatever you want to call them, and when authorities essentially police in ways that essentially put certain people on pedestals, and other people get left behind, other people get kind of stigmatized or threats collateral damage in order to appease, pander to other groups in society to try and make them feel secure, safe in their communities. And another issue I think that has become more and more apparent over the last few decades, really, in my opinion, is the what seems to be an incredibly dark silence that seems to be very prevalent in a lot of communities up and down the UK, and to some degree, I suppose you could argue that there's some of it in white working class areas as well. But I think there seems to be a lot more silence and what seems to be a bit of a climate of oppression, fear, whatever it is, in a lot of ethnic minority communities, in communities where there's a particular dominance of a particular religion, let's say Islam, where there seems to be very much a culture, a community culture, let's say, of silence, or of blind loyalty, of what seems to me to be a climate of fear, probably a climate of oppression, maybe. I don't know. It just seems like whenever there are major issues that happen in certain communities or from people from certain communities, those communities, you never really hear anything from these people. They never seem to condemn things. They never seem to come out and they never seem to rat anybody out. They never seem to come out and protest. And I just kind of find that a bit strange, really. That we're told that all of these people, that they're all innocent people. And it's like, I'm not going to sit here and be ignorant and say that everybody in these communities is guilty of something, or they're all bad people, because that would be completely unreasonable and unfair. But I do think, and I'll get onto the point why I'm making this in a second, but I think the reason that happens, I think the reason why a lot of these people don't expose certain elements within their communities and don't seem to come out and advocate for changes in their communities is because I think it's a values thing, quite frankly. I think it's an education thing. I think it's a cultural thing, religious thing, belief system, probably a loyalty to their own communities, and probably a fear of retaliation, of coming out and going against the kind of grain, if you like, of what's deemed to be normal in their areas. And the reason I'm saying these things is because I think that these are things that are causing. I believe these are issues that the authorities have just tried to for a very long time to cover up, because they've been extremely concerned about the image in which these mostly left-wing dominated authorities or ideologically driven authorities, police, councils, etc., have been operating under it, which is basically that essentially globalist ideals, if you like, and this concept of our country being a multicultural society, rather than it having its own culture, its own norms and social rules or social norms, that somehow that the authorities have had wanted to try and maintain this image that multiculturalism is a clean, completely ideal, completely positive thing for everybody. And I think while it certainly benefited a lot of those people that are in those communities, I think it's caused a lot of division, quite frankly, and pervasive attitudes of distrust and dislike from members of other communities. Because, and when I say other communities, I'm predominantly mean white working class areas where, let's be honest about it, a lot of where these immigrant populations have been placed over the last few decades have been housed, have been situated. And like I said, as I said before, I don't have any issues with immigrants per se. I don't have any problems with individuals per se, but I have a problem with segregated communities. I have a problem with this sense that the majority population, the white majority population, is somehow has to bend over backwards to accommodate everybody else, when in fact, really, it should be that those people who found their home in the UK, or home, whatever that means, legally it's their home. In terms of a degree of experience, it's their home. But in terms of where their loyalties and ancestry are and all that kind of stuff, that's different. That's a kind of a different discussion, I suppose, to some extent. But wherever these people have found themselves growing up, they just, I think that their loyalties are to their own people. I think this is the issue. It's that these communities are loyal to they're quite happy to, they've done quite well because they've been supported very much for the last 40, 50 years or so to establish their own communities, to establish their own businesses and everything else, quite frankly, at the expense of, in many ways, at the expense of other people. And, the white working classes in those areas have been told to put up and shut up, basically. And I think that what should have happened is that these immigrant populations should have been told to properly integrate into society. That meaning, essentially, that you respect the culture of that society, you respect the law, and you respect the fact that England does have its own culture, it does have its own people, its native population, and it has its own history, its own ancestral roots, and certainly over the last few hundred years, it's created its own identity. England is its own right, its own identity, just as Scotland is, just as Ireland is, just as Wales is. And I think the problem is that that the authorities have spent so long trying to convince everybody that this is beneficial for everybody, that they've essentially become more and more radical in their approach in order to try and convince everybody that that's true, when in reality I don't really think that is true. I think there have there been some degree of benefit from multicultural, I suppose, perhaps to some degree, but mostly it's benefited the people that the authorities put up on a platter. It's not a the authorities haven't really focused on the downsides, the effects, the negative effects of that message, that image, and and essentially expecting everybody to pander to everybody else. And I don't think that's been. It's not only is it this thing of essentially dictating to people that you will like this, you will accept it, regardless of what you think and feel. But we will also punish you if you speak too critically about it, because you see what I think this really is that the authorities, I believe, I think the authorities essentially realise that actually a lot of the things that they're promoting are extremely fragile, and if they don't control the narrative and the image, the optics, and if they don't control what they see as a kind of underclass, if you like, as a group of people that are most likely to dissent, to be non-compliant, then that whole fantasy, if you like, comes crashing down, And so, why am I saying all this? Well, I'm saying it because I fear that England is heading towards a very serious decline, not just economically, but culturally and societally. And I think that there are a lot of drivers that probably will eventually cause England to collapse, I think, to fragment, to perhaps become extremely divided. Not just on grounds of class, but on grounds of potentially even on grounds of ethnicity, on the grounds of radical left-wing and right-wing politics, to the point where essentially we could potentially end up in a place a couple of decades from now where people say, or enough people say, we don't want to live in a society in a region that doesn't represent us anymore, where we feel abandoned. And so either there'll be massive calls for that region to become kind of dominated in some way by a particular political agenda, social, cultural agenda, or a lot of people will start flocking to other regions in the country where they feel safer, where they feel more heard, where other authorities aren't willing to do that. And so I think, I was thinking about this last night, really, about how, could it be potentially that England could split into two or more parts? Could it literally, essentially become countries within a country? I mean, some people might argue that that's already the case in terms of the North-South divide thing. And it might be a North-South divide thing, but perhaps initially, I don't know. I mean, we know that there are severe inequalities in terms of wealth and opportunity between the northern regions and southern regions of England anyway. And I think a lot of the more sort of, let's say, traditional, more right-leaning types of people, I would argue probably for the most part, are probably mostly, I would imagine, probably more often than not in northern parts of the country. So probably predominantly working class towns and cities. Now, those places used to be Labour heartlands, But as we've seen in the last, 20, 30 years now, that's what used to be a political entity that used to be highly representative of those people in those areas and their concerns and their needs, has that Labour has abandoned those traditional principles, let's say, and essentially have become an extremely compromised, biased, and extremely politicized entity, promoting not fairness, not equality anymore, but radical progressivism. Radical ideas about essentially globalist ideals. Multiculturalism, diversity, inclusion. The LGBTQ thing, etc. DEI in employment and so on. It's become, as they say, the road to hell is often paved with good intentions, and I think really that's what's happened here is what were initially, and I talked about this before, but I think what was initially intended to be a series of movements towards a more liberal society, which was very respectable and right thing to do, I suppose. Especially from the 50s, let's say, when there was still a lot of kind of very outdated attitudes towards women, towards homosexuality, some degree of issues relating to immigration, things like that. So, there clearly was a need for more rights and representation in society for certain groups, and obviously lesbians, gays, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong in that. I think that's a good thing. That's a moral thing. That's clearly what I think most society should do. That everyone should have be represented, not be persecuted or stigmatized or treated unfairly because they don't fit some kind of they don't suit the kind of attitudes of the day type of thing. So that was clearly the right approach. But I think what's happened is that I think a lot of those movements have become extremely sabotaged, extremely politicized, and essentially have become kind of businesses, if you like, And the LGBTQ plus thing is a major example of that, which, quite frankly, to me, I think it really disempowers people. Actually, I think radical feminism disempowered women. I think DEI is actually it's just not the right approach in a modern society. I don't think it's not the way to. That doesn't mean to say that meritocracy is some ideal utopian thing either, because it's not. But I think if we're going to have, we need to have fairness. We need to have balance, and the problem is, I think what radical progressivism has done is it's gone far too far in pushing this kind of gradually sort of more dictatorial sort of nature on people, that you will accept this, you will like this, you will accept it, or else. This attitude of this kind of black or white type of mentality that it's this or nothing, it's multiculturalism or nothing, it's DEI or nothing, it's radical progressive ideals or nothing. And I think a lot of people bought into it, especially the kind of more sort of champagne socialist types, probably wealthier parts of affluent parts of London and the southeast of the country. But I think, where that kind of thing, maybe perhaps works a bit more, maybe. Perhaps, I don't know. But I certainly think in places that have, let's say, more kind of traditional ideals when it comes to raising families, marriage, the role of like religion in society, I suppose, to a certain degree, that predominantly being Christianity, I think, still, and where people are very much accepting of people's sexuality, but they don't want it shoved down their throats, kind of thing. I don't think that progressivism. I don't think to the extent that it's gone in, certainly the last 10 years, that isn't going to work in those places. And it's not because they're ignorant or bigoted or idiotic or just unaccepting of change. It's because these are people who I think realize that there is a fine line. I think there's a point where liberalism kind of becomes radical. Liberalism becomes it becomes a kind of oppressive regime, a sort of dictator, a kind of dictated liberalism. A liberal authoritarianism, even though those two things kind of contradict each other, but you get the point. So I don't know whether in the long term this radical thing is this radical left-wing progressivism is going to pan out very well in those areas. And I think, well, the reason I'm bringing that up is because I think eventually a lot of people in those areas are going to say, look, and this, let's assume that Reform don't get into power. Let's say Restore Britain doesn't get into power, or maybe even if they do, and things don't change to the extent they would like, sort of because of the way the system kind of is bent towards progressivism anyway. So even if Reform do win or Restore did get into power, you'd be fighting many uphill battles, I think. And so it may come down to a situation at the end where essentially you have grassroots movements essentially calling for sort of regional separation, a kind of independence or something, like a real regional independence, and maybe devolution would probably, I'm sure, would play a big part in that. But I don't think that would be the main cause of it, although I do think that would probably push it towards more self-reliance. How that would all work in practice, I don't know, but I could see that coming down the line eventually. If politics gets more and more fragmented and people start to see more and more demographic changes in certain places more than others, which might mean that more people start to move elsewhere. And because there may come a point eventually where the authorities can't really do much anyway. The change is just too dramatic, too embedded, too ingrained that practically there's not really much they could do. And to think that millions of people are willingly going to leave the UK under a Reform government, or a Restore Britain government under Rupert Law's direction, is to be a bit naive, really. I don't think that millions of people are going to go willingly, and to try and force people to leave that won't work, because you'll find that the left-wing establishment will come out in full force to protect those people, even if your policy is to try essentially self-preservation, to try and protect the future of your country socially, culturally, legally, economically, whatever. I get it, but it just, I don't think that will work. And because of that, I just think that I think eventually the country will. A lot of people will be saying, we'll be making calls, or maybe a referendum of some sort. I don't know, some kind of regional movement, a series of regional movements in which they might say, look, this is what we want for. We don't want a national government anymore. We want a government in our own region. We want to have all the powers to decide what we want, what we like, what we think is appropriate for our area, not some London-based, elitist bunch of, Cambridge or Oxford educated middle class or upper class types dictating the rules for everybody in the country. And given that there's I believe an extreme amount of classism in England specifically anyway, I think if as Andy Benham talked about yesterday in his speech with regards to devolution, if that does become reality and it increases over the next couple of decades, which I think it probably will actually, then especially when places where there's been real deindustrialisation, I think there will be calls for some degree of regional independence, I would imagine. Whether that means that the country kind of splits into sort of something, or I don't know, but I could see it becoming much more regionally powerful rather than this London-dominated political and financial situation that we've had for a very, very long time. A lot of white working class people are very concerned about the direction in which their communities are going in, especially with regards to what's been happening over the last couple of years now, really, with an increase in crimes being committed by predominantly migrants. And this very real. I mean, I've mentioned this on a few different videos, but this prevailing sort of like atmosphere of a sense of real injustice, actually, a sense that policing isn't being achieved fairly or in a balanced way. It's not essentially that a lot of people in those areas are feeling like the authorities are compromised, they're biased, they're policing through discriminatory policy because they want to supposedly protect certain communities while simultaneously ignoring the very real concerns of others. It's just absolute insanity. And my concern, this all links back to fragmentation, splitting, breaking down of social cohesion, the breakdown of disorder, that breakdown of the social contract is gonna eventually lead to probably a lot more resentment, bitterness towards the authorities. So I don't know whether I my fear is that people are going to start abandoning civility, respect for civil processes, civility, respect for democracy, respect for faith and hope in the mechanisms that kind of are supposed to make our society fair and accountable, that I think it's going to cause people to develop grassroots movements that essentially start protecting themselves. And actually, we're already starting to kind of see that actually in some places now. There's an organisation called The Shield. I know that Danny Tomo, who's a sort of right-wing political activist, he's now trying to establish a similar kind of sort of localized, regionally based sort of organized group of locals to protect their own towns and cities, kind of a thing. And that's what it's come to. So it's like so sort of starting to kind of see the beginnings of this, but I think it's gonna probably ramp up over the next couple of years. And Danny might very well be one of the major players of that, leading organizers or influential people in bringing that kind of sort of making that into a kind of common phenomenon up and down the country. Because the authorities. I watched a video the other day with Nick Tenconi, and he was doing a protest. I think it was in Southampton, and he asked the police outright, would you be willing to take a knee for Henry Nowak, the young British Polish lad that died in police custody after being stabbed multiple times by some Sikh guy. And the police refused. Nick asked them, I think, maybe 3-4 times, I think it was, and they just outright refused. They just wouldn't do it. These are the same authorities that were quite willing, quite happy to bend the knee for an American guy who apparently was a serious drug abuser, not particularly pleasant individual, and they took a knee for him, but they wouldn't take a knee for Henry Nowak. And when I saw that kind of was kind of quite dark, really, because what does that say? What kind of a message does that send to people? It says that essentially we won't be pressured or intimidated into doing the things that you want. We will decide what we're going to do. We will make the rules because we operate on a platform of progressive idealism, if you like, utopian, progressive, radical motives. That essentially means that the authorities don't think that they don't have to listen to criticism. They don't need to be accountable. Why do we listen? Why we're going to listen to the plebs? Why we're going to listen to the public, the normal? You hear that kind of language. The average, the normal people. The working public. This sense that the authorities are above everybody else because they wear a badge and uniform. The sense that the white working classes in particular aren't worth the effort, that they are the problem that we need to control, that they are the issue, they are the enemy of us, of that we've decided that we have we have the moral high ground, so therefore we can do whatever we want. And we will do whatever we want because we've decided that we have moral absolutism. We've decided that we are the champions of morality and you're not. And we get to decide what we deem to be appropriate and moral or not. We get to decide that, not the public. And yeah, I just found that to be, the police could have quite easily made a real difference to the image, to quite frankly, a very, very bad image that they currently have given recent events in the last couple of months. And the fact that they just refuse to do that I kind of sent a shiver up my spine, really, because, if that's the kind of attitude that they have towards the public or towards people like Nick Tenconi and towards the people that follow, that are supportive of right-wing policies, right-wing parties, that tells you that the authorities aren't on your side. I think, in my opinion anyway. And that's incredibly damaging and dangerous. Because instead of creating a sense of unity, which they could quite easily have done, whether they really wanted to or not is a different matter, but they could quite easily have taken. But the reason they didn't want to do that is because they don't want to feel like they're losing power, control. And that's ultimately what this is really about. This is about maintaining power, maintaining control, maintaining leverage in communities, like, in places where there are, I think, very rotten, poisonous, toxic attitudes and cultures and climates in certain communities in which the authorities are well aware of but want to suppress. And the reason I think they want to suppress it is because they know that once a conversation starts, once we get the truth out there, which is why I spent so long trying to cover it, you can't put it back in the box. That's what I think is happening. And that's not just with the police, that's with councils. The grooming gang scandal mentioned this many times on my channel. But it's probably perhaps the best example. It shows you that the authorities are willing to turn a blind eye, not log complaints, not create cases, not investigate, if they deem that it's better to treat a specific group as collateral damage in order to protect the rights of communities in which certain types of patterns of behaviour have been linked to. In other words, the authorities are quite happy to play morality, selective morality, when it serves their needs. In this particular case, that means protecting social cohesion, basically, because they fear that it could very easily break down, because, as I said earlier, it's a very fragile thing anyway, I think. Protecting that over the rights of very vulnerable, very troubled, let's be honest about this, but very vulnerable girls and teenagers who were supposed to be able to rely on the authorities for help. Because that's what everyone who joins the police swears an oath to do. They swear an oath of allegiance to the king, or the queen, and they're supposed to abide by, essentially, principles of bioethics. And I think that once you've abandoned that, once you've deliberately turned away from that, your police force, not only the individuals involved, but the police force as a whole, is essentially not fit for purpose anymore. It has abandoned the principles that were supposed to make it fair and decent and morally bound. And really, I think really this whole thing with the grooming gang, to me, the fact that it's nationwide, and now we're hearing that there's, I think, something like 4,000 new cases potentially being investigated, whatever that means, investigated in London now, which means Sadiq Khan's probably in quite a lot of mess here, potentially. Not that I care about the guy, I can't stand him. I think he's one of the worst things that's ever happened to him. And quite frankly, I hope that he's out of his job as soon as possible, because he's one nasty, vile individual, believe me. There are some very nasty, vile, slippery, very unpleasant people operating in the United Kingdom that have been extremely patronising, condescending, slimy, conniving, manipulative towards the general public, especially white working class areas, in order to achieve what they deem to be humanitarian ideals. At the expense of other people, of course. And then people wonder why there's so much frustration, so much distrust, such a lack of hope in the authorities. You know, and going back to the communities thing, you do have to ask yourself some very serious questions. You know, has multiculturalism actually really worked? Well, it depends. I guess it depends on how what do we mean by multicultural exactly? You know, do we mean that we have communities where people of all different ethnic minority backgrounds come together and share in one shared thing? Or are we talking about essentially a country that's, for the most part, that is, by maybe a few places, but for the most part, essentially segregated by entirely different communities that live by side, but essentially don't particularly really like each other. They don't hate each other, but don't particularly like each other. They're very different because they have different ideas about what community should be, and also based probably mostly on their upbringing behind closed doors, and also the influence of their ancestral roots, probably, whether that's their parents or their grandparents' influence. Because, you know, there's one thing. It's one thing to say that people can, you know, it's one thing to say that someone's legally English, but I do think it's a very different thing in terms of upbringing, in terms of one's ancestry, history, and perhaps more claims to the country than others. Because, you know, if you've got people in your family like I have, on both sides of my family, that fought for the United Kingdom in the First World War and the Second World War, then I do think actually, you know, I do think I can say that England is my country because my family fought for it. They fought for it, so therefore I have a right to be here because they fought for that country. And there are elements of my upbringing that would be, I'm sure, very different to a lot of other people who even though they were brought up in England and have some degree of shared experiences, you know, in public, maybe in the education system, whatever, in society, culture to some degree, there are also very, very much very real differences, I think. And a lot of it really is down to upbringing and really where your loyalties lie. And I think that is really, honestly, one of the major issues with multiculturalism. It's like, on the surface, you might think, well, it's nice to see different elements of different cultures, to be around other people from different parts of the world. Well, that's all good and well, but when they're all segregated into their own little tight-knit communities, you know, does it really, is that integration? Is that assimilation? You tell me. I don't know. You know, sure, people can come together from time to time, but I mean, you know, if people essentially are living in their own, you know, sort of, you know, enclaves, isolated areas where you've got essentially a kind of little Afghanistan here, a little Pakistan over there, a little India here, you know, a little Romania over there, a little Russia here, a little Bulgaria over there, a little Vietnamese community here, a little Chinese one over there, you know. It's difficult because you could say, well, you know, people are different and people do want different things. That's true. But to say that we're all in this together, to say that we really truly have an integrated society where everyone's kind of sort of mixed in together and sort of like part of something, I'm sorry, but that just, as far as I can tell, the UK is is anything but united. And I think, as far as I can tell, it's becoming more and more disconnected. Not to mention, the threats of Islamism as well. Let's face it, there has been in the last almost 30 odd years now, an increase in radical Islamic extremism. And again, I sort of touched upon that a bit earlier in the video with regards to perhaps why some of that stuff is happening. And just kind of a general sense that people just don't want to assimilate. People don't want to integrate. They want their version of the country. They want the country to be what suits them, what they want, right? Now, you could say, well, that's fine. I mean, everybody does want a degree of comfort. That's fine, but the problem with that is that then brings into question how you then operate in terms of how you treat communities. That's because if people want different things, if people value different things, even if they go against what is supposed to be a prevailing culture, then the authorities might say, well, we're damned if we do and we're damned if we don't. And yes, I accept that it's tricky because you don't want to abandon people, but at the same time, it's not fair to allow certain sections of society to operate in ways that wouldn't be allowed in other areas. There are different population, different demographic. So I think this is the difficulty with multiculturalism, is that it's tricky because everyone talks about assimilation and people integrate, but what does that really mean? Do we have something? Do we all have something in common here, or do we not? Because, quite frankly, having as someone that's lived very close by other areas that are dominated by other demographics, let's say, quite frankly, I didn't often feel very welcome. In fact, in some cases, I kind of felt a bit hostile to me. That you don't look like them, you don't sound like them, you don't dress like them, you don't live in that same strip or that part of the city, or that area, and then they're not going to be outright aggressive to you, but there's definitely a sort of bit of a passive aggressive sort of hostility to the place sometimes, and I think that you see the councils, in particular, have spent a hell of a long time trying to accommodate these people and pander and capitulate and make these people feel like this is their home. Now, it's not wrong, but it's the way in which they've approached that's the issue, I think. That instead of saying you need to respect that this is England, it's not Iraq, it's not Afghanistan, it's not Pakistan, it's not African nations, it's not over Eastern Europe. This is England. This is how we want England to be. We've essentially told these people, do whatever you want, be whatever you want, behave however you want, because we're not going to really police these areas because we don't want to be seen as being, we don't want a systemic racism or discrimination reputation attached to us. So we're not really going to, and not only that, we're also going to protect you from what we perceive because of our biased, compromised political interfering, biased policing approach. We're going to deem those people around you, that the majority around you, are also going to be treated differently in order to try and make sure that we appease you and to protect you, or at least give you the sense that we're protecting you. So you've got a lot of issues here going on. You've got deindustrialized towns and cities that have been left for decades essentially to rot away, which is breeding more and more resentment and frustration towards the authorities, towards the government as well. which is causing, I think, an increase in crime, more and more welfare dependency, especially as with the economy. So all really the UK, England, since Northern England in particular, has been for the last couple of decades, is really just managed decline. It's a what seems to be a very much a controlled collapse. That's how I kind of see it. So you've got those things to really, and how you resolve those things. I don't think Reform UK has got the answer to that. I really don't. I would like to believe that Andy Burnham might be the right person in that regard, but and he might be. But when you've also got the same person that's saying that we should open legal routes for people coming who would willingly break the law, come into the country legally, rather than stopping it outright. It's disappointing. It's very disappointing because part of me, as much as I hate to say it, sort of likes Andy Burnham to a degree, but at the same time, I think that he's not someone that's willing to go to the kind of more radical approach to dealing with illegal and legal, quite frankly, because that's got out of control as well, immigration, that needs to be done. And I think if he was someone that did tackle that issue in a more radical approach, but by that I mean a much stricter immigration policy, really serious border protections, then I think a lot of people would probably get behind him. If he also said that we do need to crack down on all this excessive DEI stuff and that, I think a lot of people would support him. But it doesn't strike me as someone that's very much like that. So I think that, as I said in a previous video, he'll probably be a bit pretty much a flash in the pan, which is a shame because I do like some of his ideas, but at the same time, how much would they cost? So yeah, you've got deindustrialized towns and cities that are just being neglected, essentially forgotten, especially during the Conservative years. You've got more and more sort of segregated communities, and I think in recent years, like culturally, there's more and more segregation there. There's a lot of white working class areas, people don't particularly want elements of other communities seeping into their communities, I don't think. And that isn't because they're against them, it's just that I think they feel that it's best if they sort of have their own areas, kind of thing. But also at the same time, that also doesn't help because it creates segregation as well. So it's this is difficult. I'm not saying there are any easy answers to any of this stuff here. This is messy, extremely messy, complicated stuff that I don't think the left or the right probably have any true, real answers for, solutions for. I think whatever happens here, one group is going to be pissed off. And this is why I think eventually, this is going back to what's supposed to be the point of this video about fragmentation. It may be that eventually there are calls to say, look, this is how we want to operate in this region, in this area. This is how we want things to be. And if that means legal changes or regional based legal system, I don't know, whatever, new laws, new rules, whatever, regionally speaking, that might be something that happens eventually. And with ever increasing overreach by the authorities, with manhandling issues, with unfair sentences, just excessive surveillance, almost Orwellian sort of surveillance stuff going on. I think there's just breeding more and more just a lack of respect, a lack of hope in the authorities to treat everybody the same. and that's really the major issue here. I think is that there's a gradual sense the policing is getting much more aggressive, not just physically, but in terms of like how they're treating certain groups of people overall. Whether it's with regards to online sort of hate crimes, or whether it's with manhandling people during protests and things like that. I saw footage of some I can't remember where it was now. But I think was it. I don't know if it was somewhere in the south, somewhere where there was some foreign copper that got hold of this young lad with an England flag on his back and smashed him into a bollard. I don't know if that guy's died or has serious injuries or not, but that's just completely out of order. Absolutely, completely unacceptable. And if that kind of thing continues as well, not to mention all this, just increasing overreach, ever increasing more sense of authoritarianism, then I think England is in very, very, very serious trouble. And I don't want to see civil. I don't want to see civil unrest. I don't want to see a civil war. And I think in the end, the only way that I think you may actually avoid that, I think probably, is for regions. A certain dominance will probably come to the top in certain regions of one demographic or another, and they will probably be the ones that have final say, whatever that majority might be. And I suspect in the end that may be how this all kind of plays out. Whether that means that some area, region becomes a more liberal place than others, whether one place becomes more of a Muslim-dominated area, or whatever it might be. I think eventually there will be calls to essentially pander to whoever to meet the needs of the majority in that community, in order to prevent a much worse outcome, because that outcome in and of itself wouldn't be ideal, but it might prevent a much worse one. And that's where I think we're heading towards, sadly. I think we're heading towards a place where the authorities will have to act. They will have to do something. They will have to. And quite frankly, I can see this coming down the line of maybe in 20, 30 years. Could be sooner than that. And I think at the heart of this, what this really comes down to is, I guess to some extent, it's not just an identity thing, although that's part of what it is today. It's going to be a territorial thing, I think. This is going to come down to a kind of patch. This is our patch. This is our territory. We make the rules here. This is ours. If you want to live in under these particular circumstances, you can go over there. You can go here. But this is how things are here. I don't really want to see that happen. I wish people would all get along with each other, but I think the way things are going, I just don't see that happen. I don't see everyone just getting along and just hoping for the best. I just can't see it. Sorry to say that, but I just don't think that's the reality of where things are going. And so I do think that more and more grassroots movements are going to pop up in the foreseeable future. And I think what will probably happen really before that, possibly what will happen before that, is you'll start to see, before this sort of inevitable collapse, if you like, will happen, there'll be a gradual, what I believe will be a gradual process of intimidating the pressure and the authorities. And that may be through, I actually have a list written down here. And let me be absolutely clear. I'm not promoting this stuff. I'm not saying I want this stuff. I just think that this is possibly some things that may happen. if things are likely to get worse, or as I suspect they probably are. I think first of all, you're going to start to see more and more civil unrest, many more protests. Some of them turning violent, as has been happening in recent weeks and months. Anyway, that's likely to continue. Probably, I'm guessing, might start to get worse. You could start to see some major kind of mass disobedience sort of events where people start to block borders, ports, council offices, police stations, things like that. There may be some kind of refusal to cooperate with tax systems or something like that. Maybe a sort of a mass walkout of employment or something. But some kind of mass disobedience, I'm pretty sure, is inevitable eventually. It also may very well be that some kind of grassroots movements have insiders working for councils and police trying to sort of build sort of evidence of bias and things like that. They can then build cases from. So you might start to see undercover sort of operations led by grassroots movements with regards to police councils, the judicial system, things like that maybe. You could start to see also perhaps some degree of maybe to begin with some kind of like regional sort of mass non-compliance with the voting system or something. Possibly that might be something that some people might try. I don't know whether it's the right approach. Look, let me also be clear. I accept that these things would cause major issues, and a lot of people would be inconvenienced by a lot of this stuff. And again, I'm not saying that I want the stuff. I'm not saying that this is not an absolute inevitability. But I'm saying that my fear is that some of this may come to fruition if things don't change in the coming, I'd say, the next 5 to 10 years. We really do need change, and we need it quickly. So, as I said before about potentially putting more and more pressure, intimidation on the authorities, whether that means blocking council offices, blocking the police, blocking the Houses of Parliament or something like that, might be something that people do. Essentially giving the authorities some kind of an ultimatum of some sort, whatever that might be. And as I've already mentioned, probably some degree of like on the ground, locally led, regional, grassroots kind of protection kind of services, perhaps, where people patrolling sort of squads, if you like, maybe ex-military veterans, maybe ex-police officers and things like that. Maybe it's sort of operating towns, cities, and villages. Maybe. I think for what's fair to say for absolute certain is that unrest isn't going away anytime soon. Serious protests aren't going away anytime soon, and the police can do the best to try and cover up or to be evasive and to give as little information about migrant crimes as they possibly can. But the public will always have the last say because they're the ones that live in the area, so they know what's going on. And certainly when these kind of groups set up, there'll be more surveillance going on, so they'll know what's happening probably a lot in a lot more detail that they're willing to expose than the police will. And that means then that essentially the police will start clamping down, probably getting more and more pushy and even more authoritarian to try and shut that what they perceive as a kind of threat of power, to try and push it out as quickly as they can. So yeah, this is probably not going to end well. Actually, I don't think. I don't want to be dramatic or defeatist or be alarmist or anything like that, or sort of exaggerate things. But I do think that that England in particular, I think if Scotland does eventually get independence, and let's say perhaps Wales also called for it, I think there would be perhaps some serious consequences for England. And it may be eventually that England kind of ends up on its own to try and figure itself out, to try and figure out what it's gonna be moving forwards. What we cannot tolerate is the state in which things are at right now. That this cannot go on this way. Economically, culturally, cultural divisions, religious divisions, political fragmenting, sectarian politics. We can't go on this way, and most Brits realise that we need to change direction, and politicians are saying the same thing. Nigel Farage is saying it. Rupert Lowe's saying it. Even Andy Burnham has basically said the same thing, that we're heading in the wrong direction. We are heading towards probably outright bankruptcy as a country. We're in, what is it, something like is it 3 trillion in debt now or something? I mean, I'm sure some of it's to do with inflation, but whatever the case, the country's in serious mess. Services are broken, standards have declined. Our towns and streets don't look the same anymore, not just because of demographic change, but just being kind of left to rot because there's not enough money to keep things clean or tidy or to present things nicely like they used to be in the 90s and 2000s. Better than today anyway. There's a sense that I think civic pride is declining. People's belief in civility, democracy, the social contract is very much simmering to a point where I think people are just going to refuse to abide by it eventually. And all hell will just break loose at that point. And yeah, there's just so many issues that we need to find solutions to very quickly. Inequalities between the North and South, the divisions, classist-based issues, attitudes, disparities in opportunities and in investment. How do we deal with immigration legally if political parties just outright refuse to leave the ECHR? I don't know. Growing anger and just general frustration from certain segments of working class populations that while I can understand their anger, and some of it is very much warranted, I think that they're being used, they're misguided, it's misplaced anger really, because the anger needs to really be at the people in charge, which is really the government. They are in charge of how things run in the country, and instead of throwing bins and bottles, rocks, bricks, whatever at police, which I get it. It's a dopamine. It's an adrenaline thing. Some people just want to have an excuse to be violent. Some people just want to vent their frustrations from all sorts of issues in their personal lives out on someone, and those, unfortunately, people that one's often drinking too much, swear, just kind of being uncivilized. They just give everybody else a bad name. They're not helping. They think that they're on the right side. And yes, I get to some extent that they are actually pissed off about certain things, but they're also using other things to justify their violence. And I think that's the problem. You've got people who are genuinely angry and are arguing and protesting with the police, and that's one thing. But then to start accusing officers individually and getting violent with them. It just doesn't. Not only is it just sends a bad image, and it creates an ongoing stigma that the media and the left wing authorities want to continue anyway. But it doesn't resolve anything. You can throw bins all you want, you can throw bricks all you want, but that's not gonna resolve anything. It's not gonna make anything better. Ideally, we want to do things in a democratic and civilized way, legal way, because that's how we get respect. That's how we get real change here. Because if we don't do that, then the other side wins. They've gained the moral high ground and we've lost it. All right? And that's all there is to it. So, we've got to get away. What we do have to get away from is this pervasive culture of ignoring and deliberately twisting morality and making everything about some sort of twisted sense that the authorities are doing the right thing, even though that what they're doing is actually causing more problems. And a part of that is growing political correctness online, in public. More and more rights police powers have to try and crack down on what you can or can't say online or in public. It's just there's a point in which things can go too far, and that's where I think England is at. It's just gone too far. I think there was a sort of a bit of a sweet spot in the 90s and 2000s, I think, up to a point maybe. But of course, most people didn't realise that the grooming gang thing was operating heavily during those decades. Who could have known? The police covered it up. The authorities covered it up. And that isn't every single police officer or council worker. But a lot didn't actually really know what was going on. Some suspected things. Some didn't know what to do. Some people did try to do things but were basically shut down, smeared. So you've got to think about all that stuff as well. It's not as cut and dried as I think people like to make it out to be. But I do think overall, the people that could have done things, could have exposed this in the media, in the police, the councils, the judiciary system, in social services, in care homes, etc., young people's homes, all that kind of stuff. They deliberately so in some cases were actively involved in the grooming gangs themselves, as Rupert Lowe's report shown, but also more often than not, but just complicit in just suppressing it for as long as they could, kicking the can down the road, because they just didn't want to deal with it, because they knew just how serious this issue really was and how bad this could be if it got into the hands of the media. Well, media that went also bogged down by progressivism politics, that is. And it's really only been GB News, I think, that's probably covered the grooming gang scandal, which kind of tells you everything you need to know about the other channels like ITV, Sky News, BBC, etc. So what we need to have is a complete rethink about what our country represents, what its values are, where it's going, what we actually are as a nation, rather than what we want to be, what we actually are, and or what we're supposed to be, rather, and perhaps get back to that, and get back to some of the good things that made the UK a good place, or England, although maybe the UK in general, a good place to live as it used to be. England has never been perfect. No country is. But when I was growing up, that was a good place to be. England was, yes, it had its problems, in working class areas. It had its problems with antisocial behaviour and things like that. I'm not going to sit here and say it was some perfect, dreamlike place, but I think compared to now in many respects, I think it was a better place. Maybe some things maybe have improved in some ways, perhaps, but I think overall, I think it's definitely been a massive decline, massive, massive, massive sense that just deprivation, just a country that's basically essentially just feels like it's given up. It doesn't know what it is anymore. And I think until we really deal with the complicated, very difficult, very, very uncomfortable conversations around multiculturalism, assimilation, integration, and unless we deal with the issues of legal and illegal immigration, just as a start, not to mention all the other areas I've covered, all the other things that need to be sorted out as well. Until we do that, England will never change in any good ways. It will continue to spiral and get worse and worse and worse and worse. And I think deep down, a lot of people in not only white working class areas, but in more middle class, predominantly majority white middle class areas, I think are feeling this as well, and that they know this is getting bad, like seriously bad, and that we need to get back. We need to have a very strict immigration policy. We need to have those conversations that we've tried to put off 30, 40, 50 years, really since Powell started talking about these things. We need to start having some very difficult conversations, and we need to start thinking about what we're going to do in order to resolve the issues that those conversations are about, and things that they will bring up. And we've got to get away from this just general white guilt attitude that I think is predominantly pervasive in mostly, I think, middle class white areas, demographics of the country. I would say certainly parts of London, yeah, again, probably mostly in the southeast, or maybe in the Midlands as well, and probably parts of the north actually. But it's mostly, I think, mainly the authorities these days that are holding on to that kind of thing. That because of historical injustices and historical crimes, that somehow we should all feel guilty for things that happened decades ago or a century or two ago, and we've got to get away from that. And the authorities must move away from that attitude, because that is the thing that I think is really killing a better, brighter future for England. And if we don't do that, then we will end up with more and more regionalism. We will end up with more nationalism, and essentially populism. We'll end, and actually, it won't help the left's cause either, because all it will do eventually is lead to more and more radical left wing parties, and also more and more right wing radical parties as well. And we must also talk about the decline in Christianity. The rise in Islamism, the potential impacts of green energy and how that might cause serious economic issues. Financial inequalities up and down the country. Perhaps a certain degree of devolution might be useful, might be necessary to kind of prevent the things I'm talking about here to some degree. And yeah, I just think we need to start moving back to some kind of, it may be that we need some degree of right-wing radical policies initially to get back to some kind of right, centre left balance is what I think we need in society. Because I'm not someone that thinks that only the right wing has all the answers to everything. No, because I think there are things that what's associated with the left have brought to the United Kingdom in the last century, which I think we do need to be honest about. There have been some good things that have come out from the left, but like I said, I think the left has just become so sabotaged by progressivism that it's become less about fairness and more about division, segregation, and a sense of just superiority, really. And that has to go. That must disappear. Obviously with rising debt as well, that's not going to help things. More and more unemployment is clearly going to cause a lot more fractions in towns and cities, I think, over time. Probably a lack of housing as well, decent affordable housing, probably not going to help. Education needs massive improvements. We need to get more pride back into ourselves as a nation, I think, specifically in the white working class populations. We've got to stop demonising patriotism. We've got to stop demonising anyone that supports right-wing parties. We've got to get away from biased, we've got to get away from biased media. We've got to get back to neutrality and impartiality if we're to have any faith in media and all in institutions and authorities in general in that regard, actually, as well. Because I think ultimately, really, the media is also a major problem in terms of how people, in perceptions of, and how perceptions of different groups are playing out. I think the media is also to blame for it on the left and the right. And I think we must get back to some kind of centre ground if we are to ever have a kind of more decent, a bit more reserved, a bit more respectful, a bit more overall balanced society, culture going forward. And I think in terms of our image globally as well, that has to happen, because our image internationally at the moment, I think, quite frankly, is a bit of a real joke. Especially by like America and Australia and Canada. We've become a laughing stock. We really have lost our reputation and respect globally, and we must get that back. When it comes to things like trade agreements, if we are to move further away from the EU, single market and things like that over the next couple of decades potentially. And I think just before I go, I think it's massively important that we do not head back towards the EU for all sorts of reasons, but mostly because if we do essentially rejoin the EU, you will have lost the authorities, the government, whether it's this Labour government or a future one, or perhaps even a future Conservative government, God forbid, or a Green Party or whatever, or Liberal Democrats, it would just show that democracy is performative and essentially doesn't really mean anything, which I kind of think most people kind of feel anyway, honestly. So we must respect the referendum result. We must respect that. I think it's important that we respect the wishes of the majority in that vote, I think, because I do think that in the long term, I do believe in the long term it's better for us to be outside of the EU. We can all sit here and talk about the benefits of the EU, but at the same time, you do have to be honest and say that it costs an absolute fortune to be a member of the EU. And while I accept that there have been consequences from Brexit, or rather the handling of it, I do think in the end it's better for us to try and be more and more independent and to build our standing through more and more sovereignty, through more and more independence. I think not to be a part of some major powerful institution like the EU. So yeah, so just to before I go, kind of summarise, my fear is that England is fragmenting and may continue to fragment to such an extent that eventually the country kind of splits regionally, and also because of lots of different factors that sort of combine and just said, look, we just want to go separate ways. And again, that would be an incredibly unfortunate reality, and I don't want that to happen. I really don't. I think that would be really bad for the UK, and I hope it doesn't come to that. But the way that I see things going at the moment, I think we're heading towards that, or something like it. Whether that's 30 years, 15 years from now, 50 years from now, I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball, obviously, but I can't predict the future. Who can? But that's my fear, and I hope I'm wrong. But I guess we'll see. But let's I guess give for the time being. Let's give, as much as I hate to say this, let's give Andy Burnham a chance. Let's see what he brings to the table. I'm not expecting too much out of him, to be honest with you. As I said in the previous video, I think it's probably going to be a flash in the pan of support. Probably most people won't get behind his policies because it's too heavy on taxation, going to cost too much money, hence taxation increases. So even if it would be better for us in the long term, but I don't know. I'm not an economy expert or anything, but I do think that power does need to shift away from London in the coming decades, because I think that we really live in a very unfair system, and I think that there's far too much centralised power in London, and it would be better, it would be fairer, it would be more practical, and I think overall efficient and effective for there to be some degree of devolution powers. Because I think for far too long, London really has been the powerhouse, and I think that's really caused a lot of prolonged suffering for parts of the country that need desperately to be reinvested in. And if that doesn't happen, then those places are going to very much split more and more. And I think those will really be the places where a lot of problems kick off in the coming decades. So, and like I said, anyway, I'm going to leave it there. But I hope I'm wrong, but that's just kind of how I see things at the time of making this video. So I'll leave it there for now. Hope you've enjoyed the video. I'll catch you on the next one. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.